Welcome to Unlapped. We are back after an eventful Singapore Grand Prix. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, please hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. All right, let's get into it. Katie George, Laurence Edmondson, Nate Saunders, both of you were in Singapore to not necessarily watch the most exciting race, but there was a lot that unfolded after the fact. I want to start with Danny Ricciardo's emotional interview post-race. It appears as though we could be seeing the end of Danny Ric in Formula One. It's still unclear if and when an announcement is coming regarding his future with VCARB and Red Bull overall. Nate, where do we stand as of Tuesday morning stateside as we record this?
Yeah, the if and when are both really important things to highlight because really both of them there's still a question mark around them. But yeah, Katie, you're right. I mean, Singapore actually was one of the busiest weeks in terms of news from start to finish since we got there. There was loads going on, and one of the biggest things was this Daniel Ricciardo kind of saga, if you want to call it that. So after Baku, for people listening, I think we kind of hinted at it on the last podcast, but after Baku, there were reports that Singapore might be his last race, that Red Bull were getting ready to replace him with Liam Lawson. That's obviously nothing new. We expect that is probably going to be where they go for 2024. The stories in question were what's going to happen, beyond Singapore, and this weird kind of storyline lingered over the whole weekend. We spoke to him on Thursday about it, and I think he dealt with the questions really well. And you could tell there was some frustration there with how it's been handled from him in terms of how Red Bull have handled it. And on Saturday, actually, after qualifying, he had a pretty poor qualifying, went out in Q1, which pretty poor timing given everything that was going on. But it was the first time I've ever seen Ricciardo nearly say something about Helmut Marko, who was the one who was putting a lot of the stuff about Liam out there. He was asked about some of the stuff Marco's been saying. And usually Ricciardo's really great with the press. He's always been, he's always good for an answer. He's sometimes, I think, sometimes too honest. He's one of those guys that sometimes you're like, maybe you didn't need to say that and create a headline or create, put a soundbite out there. But he kind of turned to one side and he was like, oh, it was like, do I want to say this? Do I not? And he was very political in what he wanted to say. But from everything I understand behind the scenes, they've been so upset, Ricciardo and the people that are close to him, about Marco and this constant Liam Lawson thing. And the fact is, he went into the race not knowing this is my final race. I think the emotion afterwards was the realization it probably was. But yeah, just a really bizarre situation. And to your question, Katie, of when we're expecting stuff, we still don't really know. And the thing is that Red Bull, if we were sat here with somebody from Red Bull, our friend Paul Smith from Red Bull would tell you the same thing. He'd say, I'm sorry, I don't know yet. Because the fact is, it all just seems to be in flux behind the scenes. I would say it's almost certain that Liam Lawson will be racing in Austin. But then again, I'm kind of tempering that because we thought it was almost certain Sergio Perez would lose his seat in the summer break. So the whole thing with this team at the moment is so weird. We can get into this a lot more. I don't want to hog too much of the time, but there's a massive issue behind the scenes. You've got Helmut Marko on one side, Christian Horner on the other, and I think that the Ricciardo Lawson situation is just a kind of a almost like a proxy battle between those two guys in this kind of weird power struggle that's been going on at Red Bull now for a little while. So I think Ricciardo's gone, which is a real shame because obviously I love I love having him around in Formula One. I'm a big fan of his. But from a results point of view, I think you can see why Red Bull would want to go in a different direction. But in terms of handling it, I don't think you could think of a worse way to have done it. It was pretty undignified. Ricciardo was genuinely upset after the race yesterday. There were tears. I say yesterday, sorry. I was on a 24-hour flight, so it feels like it was yesterday, the race. Not a 24-hour flight, sorry, 24-hour travel day, I should say. But yeah, just terribly handled. And I felt for Ricciardo, and I think he dealt with it pretty well. But it was clear to see that a lot of people watching were kind of stunned that he'd been left in that situation in the first place.
I think the management piece of this is important. Laz, how do you feel like Red Bull has handled this entire situation as it pertains to Danny Ric?
Awfully. I mean, there's a very good reason to put Liam Lawson in that seat for the rest of the year. And that's because it seems very clear that Liam Lawson is considered part of the future of the Red Bull driver lineup. So if you know you're going to get rid of Daniel Ricciardo at the end of the year and you're bringing in Liam Lawson, why continue with the way things are? Because the results haven't been that great for Ricciardo. I mean, it's a really harsh way of looking at it, and it all depends what's in the detail of the contracts. But because Ricciardo's always been on this contract where, remember, the reason he was brought back was because Red Bull wanted to see whether he was good enough to be a potential replacement for Perez. And because he hasn't quite shown that, it just begs the question of, well, what's left in it for Red Bull and what's left in it for Daniel? So you can understand the logic of why they would be moving it around. But like Nate said, it doesn't seem even as simple as that. That would be a very harsh way to deal with it. But it doesn't seem as simple as that, because it seems like Christian still quite likes the idea of Daniel being in that RB at least until the end of the year. And it seems like Helmut Marko likes the idea of Liam Lawson being fast-tracked in. The other reason again, I'm trying to justify this. I know there's a lot of Daniel Ricciardo fans out there, and I'm maybe upsetting them saying this, but the other reason why it might make sense to bring Lawson in at this stage is because if you're still not convinced about Checo Perez, and let's be honest, it was a good performance in Baku, but ended in the wall. That was unfortunate, but it was a bad performance in Singapore. So if you're still not convinced about Perez, if you do give Lawson, and you're not convinced about Ricciardo really, and you do give Lawson those 6 races to get a bit of a run up, if he really performs, is on or above the pace of Yuki Tsunoda, with minimal time in that car prior, you might actually look at him and say he could be a real candidate to replace Perez if they need to. And then you've got Isaac Hadjar in F2. So, he's in the title fight. If he wins F2, looking a little bit less likely now. Gabriel Bortoleto, Brazilian driver's looking very good for that. But even so, if he did win it, he wouldn't be allowed to carry on in F2. So he'd have to land somewhere. So, there's some logic to kind of like starting to move it forward. But the way it's been dealt with, to go back to your original question, the way it's been dealt with has been awful, because any driver who's been in F1 for as long as Ricciardo has had the success, is basically as loved as he is in F1. I think it's important to be able to know when your sign-off race is, in the same way that Sebastian Vettel did at the end of 2022. Thinking back to Fernando Alonso's first retirement, I know he's come back, but that there was a big song and dance about that. There were T-shirts made by McLaren. He did donuts on the pit straight in Abu Dhabi. Things like that, I think, are really important to sign off a career in the right way, certainly for someone who's given so much to the sport. And that's why I think it's been dealt with so badly, is that if they have made this decision, I understand the reasons, they may be harsh, but at least do it properly and give Ricciardo the sign off, that he deserved. And I don't think he got that. So that's my kind of general initial download of the thoughts about it. But like Nate said, it's very complicated behind the scenes as to exactly what's going on and exactly when we'll get an announcement.
When Helmut Marko and Christian Horner do not agree, which I think has happened often throughout their time working together, who generally wins out in those situations?
It's a hard one to say. I mean, generally speaking, you can look at Yuki Tsunoda as a good example of that. Christian Horner, again, you can go to almost every driver decision that's made, and there's some element to this at the moment in there. Yuki Tsunoda, it's the flip situation of this. Helmut Marko would be very keen to see Yuki given a shot up there. Marko is somebody that has been a big believer in Tsunoda's kind of career progression. Christian Horner, you talk to him privately, you talk to him publicly. He's maybe less certain public, but in private, he's like, there's no chance we're putting him in the Red Bull seat. Doesn't agree, doesn't think he's got the right temperament, etc. So it really does seem to be a case by case basis. And this is one of the things that's difficult with the Red Bull situations. You have to understand the dynamics. It used to be that Dietrich Mateschitz ran that team. Every single decision went through him, and he obviously knew that Christian and Helmut probably had an interesting power dynamic, but he could broker that as the main guy. And if he said something, the person whose decision that went against kind of accepted it. Like, okay, well that's what the boss wants. I get it. Sometimes I don't. Now with him gone, they answer to the shareholders at Red Bull. And that's where it's becoming a lot more interesting, because there's I was trying to work out over the past couple of weekends exactly who the main kind of power players are within that. And you've got a lot more people that are probably less inclined or less knowledgeable about Formula One than Mateschitz was. For people listening, Mateschitz passed away in October 2022. I remember we were in Austin at the time when that news came through. And since then, there's just been this huge power vacuum at the team, and it's taken a little bit of time, but I think this year, across the board at Red Bull, you're really seeing the issue that has left longer term, because we're seeing this great exodus from the Red Bull team more generally. As we're sitting here now, I just had a press release through that Will Courtney, from the head of the strategy team at Red Bull, is moving over to McLaren. So that's the third member of McLaren's senior team that's moving over. So it's obviously Newey's going, Jonathan Wheatley's going. Now you've got Will Courtney. Will Courtney's one of the lesser known guys, but he's actually a very important part of that. We talk about that strategy team at Red Bull quite a lot. And a lot of this, it's not all down to this, but whenever there is a power vacuum, you see things like this happen, don't you? In any sport, in any business. And yeah, we can see it most of all in the driver decision. But to answer your question, Katie, about who actually wins out the most, I think they've got a pretty good record. I think it's about 50-50. And the thing was, before, they could stomach that because they knew, okay, well, I understand what Matches wants. Now, I think both of them think if one of them wins one decision, they're losing control of the team. Certainly Horner, you think about everything that Horner's had to face this year. Behind the scenes, we still understand it's still a pretty sketchy situation. There's obviously ongoing questions about will Max leave, etc. So really, really unbelievable, really, that a team that's this good has ended up in this situation. So yeah, it's a fascinating one, and I think this is one that Marco will win. And sorry, just to add to this point that I think is fascinating, is that this closes a loop on one of Marco's kind of blunders recently that he made, because he was the one who was very insistent that Red Bull sign Nick de Vries when Nick de Vries had the great performance at Williams at Monza last year. Sorry, last year. I keep dropping days and years out of my mind. 2 years ago. And obviously that then led to them signing him, letting Pierre Gasly go to Alpine. Christian Horner was never convinced by that, but he said, you know what? Okay, I'll
try it,
play ball. This, because and Horner really didn't mind seeing the back of Gasly. He thought, fine, we can make some money off him from Alpine. The Nick de Vries experiment was a complete disaster, in terms of performance, and that then led to Marco having to make the fairly embarrassing admission. Okay, we'll let Daniel in. Helmut Marko, I think, has always held a bit of a grudge that Ricciardo left in the first place. He was like, why do we need to bring this guy back? But by the time de Vries had gone, he really had lost some of his leverage. So now we're at a position again where Horner, the guy that Horner wanted in, the guy that Horner kept, he's kind of on the outs now as well. So you can see the dynamic kind of shifting back and forth between the two. And it might seem inconsequential, all of these little things. When you add them all together, it's this kind of big cauldron of things happening behind the scenes. And, I know that people use this now as a throwaway line, but it kind of is a bit like Succession. They're not brothers and they're not related, but it's this question, it's this ongoing question of who has power, and the people who have power, can they hold on to the power? And that's kind of where this all is. And Ricciardo is just kind of stuck in the middle of all of that.
I think it's been a bit stunning after multiple years of on-track dominance and team dominance. I feel like this year, yes, Max Verstappen has continued to be great in a variety of different ways. The off-track stuff has been somewhat of a shit show for the entirety of this season. I don't know a better word to really use. The fastest lap was another thing that kind of turned eyes and opened your ears. So Laza, I'm curious what you thought of Red Bull's situation with Daniel Ricciardo getting fastest lap. Max Verstappen, of course, was happy that he stole 1 point from Lando Norris, but what do you make of that situation?
Well, at the time, I thought it was, borderline of what really should be allowed in F1. Whether you can actually find a regulation that suggests it shouldn't be allowed is another question. But the fact that you've got two teams which are meant to be working, as individual teams for their own interests, and a driver outside the top 10 basically running last, and they go and get the fastest lap, because although that won't get Daniel Ricciardo the point, it will take the point away from Lando Norris, who was holding that fastest lap at the time, and therefore the point in the championship, which may not be inconsequential at the end of the year. So, I thought it was a bit naughty. Of course, the official reason given by RB is that, well, this could be Daniel's, they actually said in the press release, well, in case this is Daniel's last race, this was the quote from Laurent Edmondson, the team principal, admitting really that he doesn't have any say in what goes forward. We knew that anyway, but by saying, well, it could be his last race, therefore we wanted to send him off on a high with a fastest lap.
It's so
I'm sure
shitty.
I'm sure when Daniel looks back at his career, that fastest lap won't stand out as the highlight of it. And in fact, that whole weekend, I think, he will probably quite want to, probably wish he could go back. Like I said, he probably wish he could have done it properly. And if we'd all known it was Daniel's last race, then perhaps it would have made a bit more sense. But yeah, it was a situation that I was pretty uncomfortable with from a sporting perspective, because, these teams should be working autonomously. And yes, they have the same owners, but, they're not allowed to share, information by regulation. They're not allowed to share information about the car and about, development going forward. And I feel like when one team starts to get involved with taking points off another, it is a bit naughty. And it reminded me of a Sauber, I think back in 1997, getting in the way of
Villeneuve,
another car. Villeneuve, yeah, in Jerez, and yeah, and things like that. And Sauber at the time was a Ferrari engine customer, and therefore it was kind of trying to help out Ferrari and Michael Schumacher in the championship. So there was an element of that. And, I mean, maybe these things just always happen in F1. It's just part of it. And of course, there's always going to be links between the teams because, you do have things like engine deals going on in the background. And perhaps if it was another situation and, there was Mercedes going for the championship and a Williams or something, able to help out, they would. But yeah, I felt it was a bit naughty.
It'd be fine if Daniel Ricciardo knew that was his last race. And when Mekki says, well, we wanted him to savor what could have been his final race, then we can all say, oh, okay, that makes sense. But it's unclear if it was his last race. And it seems unclear within people on Red Bull's team.
Yeah, and it's a funny one, isn't it? Because you're like, so you guys are saying you didn't even have the courtesy of giving him the send-off race, but you were like, yeah, let's give him the fastest lap. So complete nonsense about that. I think it was a very convenient kind of excuse for them to use because they can say, well, look, we were trying to help Daniel out. But, Laurence is right. It's right on that line. It might be, your feet might be over the line slightly in terms of is that acceptable or not? Because it opens up the fascinating point now. If the RB going forward has just had a bad race, one of the drivers has had a bad race, do they now? I mean, they've obviously lost the excuse of, oh, we're just trying to send someone out on a high, but the FIA didn't really, didn't look into it. And I had a little look at the regulations about what is acceptable there, what isn't. The only thing I could find, and again, this is kind of murky in itself because it's very vague, but the International Sporting Code 12, I always get these wrong, 12.2.1i says any infringement of the principles of fairness in competition, behavior in an unsportsmanlike manner, or, and this is the important bit, an attempt to influence the result of a competition in a way that is contrary to sporting ethics. So that last point is if you were McLaren, or at least I would assume if you're McLaren, you'd be looking at that going forward, because if this becomes a trend now, it's obviously got an influence on the championship. So yeah, I never will believe that they did that just to send Danny Rick off, and they suddenly had a momentary act of charity at the end. I tried to find out in the media pen afterwards. I asked Yuki, were you having similar conversations? And I think Yuki could understand that I was trying to ask, because obviously if he was talking to the team about it, then you can point to it and say, well, look, they were trying to see which of their cars they could do it with. But yeah, I think that'll be fascinating. I mean, I don't know if radio messages have come out yet from, a lot of the time these kind of come out in the days after, but yeah.
Nate,
I think
that's called a leading question.
It was a very leading question. And, I apologize to Yuki Tsunoda on the off chance he's listening for that. But yeah, I think it really does skirt the line there. Red Bull would turn around and I mean, Christian Horner basically said, well, you've got to ask RB what they did. I think they would say, well, we run two teams and we pay for two teams, etc. But it gives you so much power when you've got two extra cars on the racetrack. Mm-hmm. And the issue you have as well is that I think you have to be so careful with these things as well. Because let's say in one of these races coming up now, one of the RBs just has genuinely or legitimately has a car issue. One of the drivers makes a mistake and puts it in the wall. If that has a detrimental effect on Lando's race now or on Piastri's race, and just happens to screw one of those drivers over, you suddenly look at it and you're like, well, they did the thing with Ricciardo a few races back. It's almost like it opens up, it makes any kind of conspiracy about that true or false. It makes it much easier to believe, and suddenly the integrity of all of it becomes a lot more murky. I'm not sure if that makes any sense or not, but the fear is that, you start doing one and it becomes more acceptable to kind of continue it, or at least to believe that they're doing it. So really shaky ground. And I hope that there's some clarity on it about that. But obviously, at the end of the day, there's nothing the FIA can do about Christian Horner going down before the race and saying, hey, guys, by the way, you know the drill, right? 5 laps from the end. If XYZ is true, you guys come in, make the excuse. You guys come up with the excuse. You say whatever you want to say, but you're bringing him in. You're doing soft tires and you're doing a fastest lap. Hard to police that. So I don't really know what they do about it. If it's not on the radio, I don't know what else you can do.
Well, the FIA also...
Just to say, like, one of the reasons why a team outside the top 10 wouldn't usually do that, because, I mean, one, why would you? Obviously, you've got nothing to gain, but also by doing that pit stop, putting the car out there, going for a fastest lap, you run that risk of of the car being on the edge right at the end of the race and having a shunt. Not to say that people shouldn't drive racing cars fast, because that's what they're there for, but it's why it's really not standard practice at all, to go out there and do it. It was very, very unusual. In fact, the first time I remember it happening, I mean, it does occasionally happen where a car just makes a pit stop out of sequence, and just happens to end up on soft tires at the end of the race and gets the fastest lap just by kind of driving at fairly regular pace, just because of the advantage of soft tires in a race. But yeah, really unusual for someone to go out and do that on purpose and chase the lap, which Daniel clearly was, and he did a very good job because he got it.
Was one point that was taken away from Lando Norris, who won his third race of the season, converting pole position to a win. Max's lead now stands at 52 points with 6 races left, 3 of which have sprint races. Laz, I'm just curious how impressed you were by Lando Norris's drive.
Yeah, it was very good the whole weekend. I mean, if you look at coming off the back of Azerbaijan, where that yellow flag in qualifying in Q1 ruined his whole weekend, and there were signs throughout that weekend that the pace was there. It was just that one yellow flag that kind of disrupted the whole flow of it. So I think it was very important for him to bounce back immediately and also win by a significant margin. He actually had 2 very near escapes brushing the wall during the race, which kind of showed you how hard he was pushing. And I think, again, I feel like that was almost, to prove a point and have this huge margin. Of course, sometimes it's good to have a sizable margin in case, you need to pit again or anything like that. But I did feel like there were times when he was really kind of trying to prove a point above and beyond. And then the significance of that 52-point gap, of course, it has come down again, which, Lando needs to continue doing for the rest of the year. But now we're in this situation, and this always happens every time we're in a title battle, is that Max can basically finish second for the rest of the season in all races and sprint races. And it doesn't matter if Lando goes and wins more, because Max will win the title based on the points that he has in hand now. I think we often talk about that when it's more of a 2-horse race and how important that is, that basically, if it was a Nico Rosberg, Lewis Hamilton situation, both in the same car, streets ahead, then it's often the case it's actually quite easy to finish second. This year, I don't think that is as relevant because you've got so many cars that are potentially challenging for podiums, with Ferrari occasionally right up there, Mercedes. I think, before the end of the year, we'll probably have a couple of rounds where they go towards the front. And then, of course, Oscar Piastri as well, as such a strong teammate to Lando Norris, potentially getting in between Norris and Verstappen. So not anything, not to say that, the season is now over, but I think also, a point of just how big a challenge Norris still has ahead of him.
And in terms of the constructors, McLaren now pulls further ahead. They're at 516 points. Red Bull is in second with 475 points. Checo finished with just a single point, finishing P10 in the race. Piastri, I thought, had a strong race to continue with McLaren's consistency that we've seen from both drivers. Nate, if you're a betting man by the end of this thing, regardless of what happens in, the individual drivers' championship, what do you think happens with the constructors?
Oh, I mean, this is an open goal now for McLaren, surely. I mean, they've got the best car, Piastri and Norris both in the form of their lives. And just to go back to the Red Bull point, they're getting exactly what they deserved, because the whole thing about Perez before the break was he's under-delivering. And they were like, no, wait till those street races. And yeah, Baku, there's a great case to be made that he probably should have been on the podium there if it wasn't for that last lap tangle. Singapore, he was rubbish. He was just, back to, the Perez of a few races before the break. So, Red Bull have kind of left that door wide open. And yeah, difficult. I mean, I think I need to go back and have a look at the stat, but I'm pretty sure McLaren have outscored Red Bull now at basically every single race that Piastri and Norris have finished since about June time. So the swing in momentum has been crazy. And even, Piastri is the driver out the two of them that maybe finishes lower more often, but he's still finishing top 5 most races, if not podiums. So it looks like, I mean, it would be stunning, truly stunning if McLaren didn't win it from here, because they've got the lead. Perez isn't going to be scoring good points all year. So yeah, I'd put all of my money on McLaren.
I know so much of our focus has been on Daniel Ricciardo's future, and Checo Perez Laz is certainly under contract, but we know that means nothing when you drive for Red Bull. Is there any chance that we could see maybe a change to Checo's seat at the end of the season going into 2025?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, that is part of the thinking behind Lawson as well, maybe, is that you give him those 6 races and he proves a point, and then you can put him into that seat if you feel like you need to at the end of the year. Because, I don't think it's going to get any easier for Red Bull next year. They have a winter of development, but considering the big names that are leaving the team, I feel like if they can just stay in touch with McLaren, assuming McLaren don't take any missteps, and also stay ahead of Ferrari and Mercedes, who will be looking to go out in this regulation set on a bit of a high, then that would be a good year for them. And if they're going to stand any chance of finishing high up in the constructors, which of course the prize money is attached to, then they're going to need 2 drivers performing. And I think if they can get a gauge from the 6 races of Lawson that he's going to do a better job than Checo, I don't think they'll have any qualms about making that change, because as Nate mentioned earlier this year, it was under serious consideration for the summer break. So the winter break, I think it's still definitely an option.
If that volatility isn't enough, you currently have a great article up on ESPN.com, because Max Verstappen may have hinted at quitting Formula One as well. What more can you tell us on that?
So this goes back to a story which developed throughout the Singapore Grand Prix weekend, where it started with the president of the FIA saying that Formula One drivers should swear less, and there was a comparison with rappers and him saying we're not like them. I think that is a slightly problematic statement in itself. Lewis Hamilton pointed out as much, saying it has a racial element to it, and I think that was the case. So bizarre that Ben Slem would be using that example when he's talking about driver language. Anyway, to get back to the Max side of it, Max went off and dropped a F-bomb in the first press conference after those MBS quotes surfaced. I still wonder whether he did it. There's a bit of me thinks, he did it to test the waters a little bit. So limited sympathy that he then got called in front of the stewards. And in the past, and there is past precedent for the penalty a driver will get if they swear. So in the past, a very similar example, we'll just go with that, is Toto Wolff and Fred Vasseur at the Las Vegas Grand Prix, also dropping F-bombs in the FIA press conference in relation to all the issues they had with the track in first practice in Las Vegas last year. And they got formal warnings. And there were some mitigating circumstances in that, a drain cover had gone through the floor of one of Fred Vasseur's cars, and Toto Wolff was being agitated by a journalist in that press conference. Worth watching, actually, if you want to go back and have some entertainment. And whereas Max, Max was talking about his car in the Singapore press conference and just saying that it was effed when, as soon as he went out in qualifying, he knew from that moment that he was going to have a problem for the whole of the Baku weekend. And so the stewards decided that it was coarse language, vulgar language, potentially offensive language, and therefore gave him the equivalent of community service in F1. He's got to do some kind of public, so something that helps public service. I can't remember the exact quote on it, but anyway, along the lines of kind of, I guess, going to like a stewarding thing, or perhaps working with marshals or something like that. I can imagine it'll be F1 related. And Max just thought this was utterly absurd. And I do tend to agree with him that this idea that drivers in situations like that, where also to be clear about his press conference, it isn't being broadcast live. It can be used by broadcasters, but they will have the opportunity to bleep out, whatever he says, which is the same as the team radio. And also, I think, the reality is that as long as it is censored, there is an element of the rawness of who these drivers are and the personality. And so Max, by the end of the weekend, after qualifying, he was in the top 3, which means he had to go to another FIA press conference, and he just gave one-word answers and very short answers as a kind of protest to this, and then held a full press conference with everybody outside, inevitably of which the topics were not about qualifying, but about his relationship with the FIA and how much it's worsening. And he did the same on Sunday after being in the top 3 in the race. And then when we were talking to him in the Red Bull hospitality, he kind of made clear that if things like this continue, it's not just this, but if there's all these kind of things that make it less enjoyable to be a racing driver, and he has to worry about this and worry about that, then why would he bother continuing, beyond kind of current contract ends in 28? We know how much we speculate about where he might end up, but why would he continue when he could go off and do another racing series or all the other things that he is genuinely interested in doing? Always said he's not too worried about breaking all the records, loves winning, but it's not the only thing in his life. And I think if F1 becomes this, I guess in his eyes, it's kind of like nanny state where whatever you do, you get penalized and it's no longer any fun, then why would he commit so much of his life to it? And that was essentially how he left it at the end of the weekend. And we'll have to wait and see how he feels because we've got this big break now before Austin, how he feels when he gets to the United States and whether he's, kind of had a chance to talk it through either with the FIA or the people around him, or he's going to double down on it.
Did you say nanny state?
Nanny state. Yeah, I think is that not a term that translates to the United States?
So. Do elaborate?
Basically an over-controlling government.
It's like 1984.
Officials, yeah. George Orwell's 1984 is a fairly good example. I mean, that's an extreme nanny state. That's beyond nanny state.
That's it's not quite what I was thinking. But
an intervening government is often called a nanny state in this country. So the Labour Party is often called a nanny state.
Okay, fair enough. It would be a shame to think that the FIA would run off one of the greatest F1 drivers just by being too controlling, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I was in that. Laurence and I were both there on the Sunday. I don't buy with Max when he's like, "I'd quit on this," because I think I think when he says it there and then, he's kind of thinking that. But I don't know. I think Max. I kind of agree. I think part of me thinks he went in there and was like, "I'll just drop an F-bomb, see if I can get away with it," because Max did say sometimes people don't speak. It's not their first language, but Max speaks English a lot of the time. And he's. If I'm not mistaken, most of the time in Monte Carlo he's speaking English because he's not in a relationship with a Dutch woman. He's Kelly is it Kelly Piquet? It's Kelly Piquet is Brazilian, so they're not speaking Dutch to each other. They'll be speaking English to each other. So the idea that he just like let this swear word out of nowhere, I was kind of like, well, it's not the best. I don't know. I just think it was. I thought he handled it very well once the thing came out saying he had to do the service, but I don't know. I think Max does have frustrations about a lot of things with Formula One. That is definitely true, and we know that. He hates doing a lot of the media. He hates that someone says something in a press conference and it gets put to him 10 minutes later in his own press conference. He hates all that stuff. I think he hates the kind of all the bits that come with it. But yeah, I mean, it's not. I don't think it was. I mean, maybe he feels that strongly about it, but I don't know if it's a quitting matter. I mean, I think that
I don't think he said that either. He said it was one thing that is building up towards that. And this is what I tried to lay out in the article as well, is that it's not just that. And then another example he brought up was Carlos Sainz getting a financial fine for crossing the track after his accident in qualifying. Now, obviously, you're not allowed to run across a live track. But in Carlos Sainz's case, there's a red flag. All the cars were going back to the pits before the point that he was crossing the track. And Max kind of said, look, we've been doing this since, we were kids in go-karts. We know what we're doing around racetracks. And so I think it's this wider thing. Sorry to interrupt, Nate, but just to point that out, I don't think Max was saying, I'm going to quit because they've given me this. That's not it. It's more like it's all building up. And at some point I might find this is just not worth my time because he's got other things he wants to do. He really does. And I think it's clear.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that is clear with him, isn't it? I mean, he has consistently said to us in the media that he doesn't want to still be racing kind of beyond 30 years old, or maybe into his early 30s. So, and that part of it with Max, I do believe. I think he is someone who would kind of get to a certain point. I think it'll be very difficult for him if he finds another car that can win him championships. That will be the big killer. I think it'll be easier for him to walk. If let's say he gets to 32 and he's like, okay, I'm actually in a rubbish team. Car's not very good. Then it's very easy for him to say, right, I always said I was going to quit. I'll leave. But yeah, it's definitely to your point, Casey. I think it's it's all these. If all these things contributed to kind of making him just walk away, that would be a real shame. But I also actually I would really respect it if he did that. I would really respect if he got to 32, he'd won all these titles because it's great to see Fernando still in the sport. It's great to see Lewis still in the sport, but Fernando is waiting for the chance to be champion again, and it may never come again for him, and we all think his legacy is not going to change whether he quit 8 years ago or he quits in 2 years. His legacy was always going to be one of the greats of the modern era. Obviously, it's better if you're a 7-time champ than 2-time champ, but he's kind of holding on for that. If Max just said, I'm done, Rosberg did that after he won a championship. Was like, I'm done. Lots of reasons behind it, but it was like, wow, okay, to actually do that when you're on top and to say, no, I'm now finished. I think it takes a lot to do that. So if he ever does do that, maybe we can house this clip somewhere and we can replay it. But yeah, it would be pretty impressive. But yeah, if it's just because of an accumulation of F1 being silly, that would kind of take some of the I guess some of the sting out of that story in terms of, because then the argument would be, well, F1's done this to itself, et cetera, et cetera.
But I would be willing to bet when it comes to Max Verstappen walking away from the sport, we will never know until after the fact, and it's a done deal. Like we were talking about Daniel Ricciardo getting his swan song or the last dance, like getting to have his farewell moment. I don't think Max Verstappen wants that. He's going to just walk away and it's going to blindside all of us.
Well, he's at the right team to do that, Katie, because Red Bull won't give him it anyway. they'll be like, is he leaving? We don't know. It could be Liam Lawson, it could be Yuki. We don't know. But you should just go say goodbye to him anyway. We gave him the fastest lap just to be sure, because he might retire.
On that note, that's where we will leave it as we head into a 4-week break. But of course, we will be back giving you all the F1 news. Thank you both so much. Laz, I know you're still in Singapore, so enjoy your time. Nate, enjoy some time off, and we'll see you guys next week on Unlapped.